What's the orientation? Is it oriented towards any star systems, or, I mean, when it's referred to as a cairn, when it's called a cairn is what you bury people in. In any case, Afroasiatics. This is a Lao Tzu, attributed author of the Tao Te Ching, who J.A. Rogers describes as his mother as pearl black, which means that he would be, well, Afroasiatic would be in our vernacular. Li Tiguai was a martial artist and immortal, one of the nine immortals of Taoism. In one of these depictions, also known as Li of the Iron Crutch. This is a Japanese Buddhist deity. Note the hair. And this old quote, Japanese proverb, for a samurai to be brave, he must have a bit of black blood. So contact between Africans and those of what we can refer to as Asia. So Li Tiguai, as an example. So as the text here is from Wikipedia. There are actually books on him, but and I'm putting this together. One of the things that I found about Li Tiguai, and the reason I included this in there, is when we're talking about contact between nations, Egypt, Kemet, and China had a long trading relationship. It's not really talked about so much in Asante, but they both had extensive drug technologies. They both had yoga and martial arts systems. They both had kind of interplay and intertrade between religious ideas and practices. And Li Tiguai, who, when I look at that picture, I'm thinking, okay, so is it possible, I mean, because you see different representations of him. So if you're going to basically denote skin color using ink, how would you do that, and how would you also do hair texture and hair color? And is it possible that there are black Africans in China? Well, the Shang dynasty in China were referred to as black Chinese. Around 2700 BC. So Li Tiguai. One story, he's in the center of a number of myths. One story says that when he was younger, he was a handsome and motivated man who achieved fame for his ascetic and philosophical acumen. By his early 30s, he was able to go for weeks without eating or drinking, and could become so attuned to the Tao that it was like a dead man. Words of these exploits eventually reached the divinized Lao Tzu, who allegedly returned to Earth to become Li's patron and mentor. Under his expert tutelage, Li's aptitude at various magical and superhuman feats flourished, eventually earning him a following of devoted pupils and admirers. Eventually, Lao Tzu taught Li how to make a voyage of the spirit, separating his soul from his body in order to travel to the celestial realms. After this final lesson, the old master invited his pupil to visit him in the heavenly abode of the immortals and gods, which he did. So he began to prepare for his journey, instructing his most prized student on how to care for his material body while he was away. As a contingency, he advised the young man that his body should be immediately cremated if he did not return within 7 days. Unfortunately, while he was off in the celestial spheres, not watching the clock, I guess, his pupil received some troubling news. His beloved mother had taken ill and was consumed by anxiety over his mother's health. He remained conscious of his duty to his master and continued his vigil over Li's lifeless body. But on the night of the sixth day, because remember he's supposed to cremate the body after 7 days, his mother turned for the worse, and so on the night of the sixth day, he cremated his master's body. So Li comes back to his body after the seventh day and finds that it's ashes. So this is difficult. So fearful that he would be extinguished, he entered the first available material form he could find, the body of a recently expired beggar man, which is how he's depicted. At first, because remember he was handsome, his vanity railed against this repulsive form as the beggar was covered in sores, had enormous bulging eyes, and smelled incredibly foul. He considered leaving in search of a preferable body. To his surprise, because a preferable other dead body, right? To his surprise, Lao Tzu appeared and suggested that accepting this body might be the final step he would require to truly embrace immortality. No sooner had these words been spoken than Li realized the irrelevance of what his body looks like. And in honor of his student, he gave him two gifts. Lao Tzu gave him an unbreakable staff and a gourd filled with magical elixir that could cure all illness. With that, Lao Tzu instructed his immortal pupil to act for the good of all people and vanish. So his first act, Li Tuguai's first act after this revelation, was to visit his neglectful student's home and cure his ailing mother, basically showing forgiveness. And after this point, he became a wandering healer who constantly looked out for the needs of the downtrodden. Now, the reason I bring this up is to look at, there's a lot of common themes between this and the Egyptian values of justice and caring for those less fortunate for you, and looking out for justice. And that's one of the things that's a theme in terms of the legend about Li Tuguai, besides his depiction here. He became an active participant in the lives of everyday people, including ministering to the sick and pronouncing moral sanctions against immoral magistrates, rewarding honest and hardworking peasants and fishermen, exposing the evils of corruption, and especially of bureaucracy, and teaching the worthy about the secrets of immortality. He's also seen as the patron of doctors and pharmacists, due to his reputation as a healer. And due to this connection, the signs of traditional Chinese dispensaries often bear the image of his crutch or gourd. Likewise, his spiritual potency made him a favorite among some religious Taoists and spirit mediums, and he's also seen as the patron of cripples, beggars, and other quote-unquote social undesirables. So not only religious technology, but also architecture. So these Chinese pyramids, which exist in the present day, like that, and those are reminiscent, for example, of the step pyramids in Saqqara in Egypt. Unless people just naturally build pyramids in those forms for some coincidental reason. And ancient Europeans basically thought there were two kinds of black people. Those from, as your current readings might suggest, from Kush, and you know where that is, and Indus Kush. Known externally as the Harappans or the Dravidians. Not only India, but also Vietnam. And the Dravidians of South India. The reason I point this out is we talked about Aryans before. You recall that? Arya in Sanskrit means pure in spirit. So when there was an author, Bernal, talks about the ancient view of Greece, the ancient model of Greece versus the Aryan model of Greece, and the Aryan model of Greece is German scholars interpreting Sanskrit and suggesting that, well, it must have been a race of white Aryans that swept down through the Khyber Pass, conquered all of India, built all these buildings, and disappeared without a trace, because these black people couldn't have made them. Which is not what the Indians themselves say. No, we've always been here. Khyber Pass, Aryans. No, Aryan means pure. It was not a racial term, but okay. Durga Temple, which is an aspect of Kali. A Buddha head. What I'm about to show you is basically just as an idea of medical technology. This is a 1,000-year-old, actually more than 1,000-year-old now, Tibetan tanka, which is a painting depicting conception, stages of gestation, labor and birth. So, for example, how do they know all this stuff without microscopes? And where'd the knowledge come from? And just leave that as an open question, not suggesting anything. So if the animation holds true across platform, here you have the couple making love, tastefully covered. And the baby is coming in, the spirit of the baby is coming in on a rainbow. Oh, that's cute. Okay. Then the egg goes through different changes, and this little body begins to form astrally. Cells start dividing. I mean, that's our contemporary. And then, so you have division of eggs. Then you have a being that's like unto a fish with actual gills, like you had. You're breathing water. Then an amphibian. Then a mammal. Then stages of labor and birth. Right, and the text comes out in white instead of black, so you can't see it. Is it working yet? Okay. All right. Well, I told you that already. So, all right. Now, the Moors. This is written by Poole, who is a British historian. And what he talks about is he's referring. His book is called "The Story of the Moors in Spain." So one of his earliest references in Al-Makari, History of Mohammedan Dynasties in Spain. There was a drought in 1070 BC in Spain, which was followed not long after by an invasion of Africans, banished from North Africa by a king from whom they had revolted. Now, if you remember, a number of you have made references to the African Constitution that was referred to earlier. In one of the rights of the African Constitution is if You didn't agree with your leader, you had the right to leave. And so these did. The right to revolt was allowed. You could leave. Their leader was known by what the Romans called him in Latin Batricus. The Romans defeated them 157 years later. So from 1070 BC, they held at least 2 cities in what is now modern-day Spain. They settled at Cadiz, advanced at the interior, extended settlements, built cities, and increased their numbers by marriage. They spread to the Frankish country in the east and appointed kings. Their capital was Talica, which is now Italica, now ruined. Talica was in the district of Isbila, which is now Seville in Spain. So there was 2 conquests of the Iberian Peninsula, that is Spain and Portugal. One was in prehistoric times, 1070 BC, and the second was 711. So 11 African kings ruled Andalus, which is also the name for that area, for 150 years, falling to the Romans after 157 years. So 700 BC, the 25th dynasty in Egypt. The Ethiopian Taharka was a young general. He led a garrison into Spain. He's also known historically outside of Kemet as Taraco. The Spanish history books, Chronica General 1553, refer to Taraco as an Ethiopian who later ruled Egypt, which is still right in line with what you've been reading. Cartouches, which are basically, they look like little pieces of jewelry you wear around your neck. They have Egyptian hieroglyphics on them. Cartouches have been found in Almancar, Spain. The cartouche of Shishak, a Libyan king, was found in a tomb in Almancar. And Libyans ruled with support of the Nubians in the 22nd and 24th dynasties of Kemet. They were overthrown by the Nubians in the 25th dynasty, which may have been mentioned in Asante in your readings. All this is a prelude. So, for example, when Napoleon talks about Africa begins at the Pyrenees, because Africans have been coming into what is now southern Europe for some time. Many Africans, Berbers, Ethiopians were black people, so much so that the Greeks and the Romans, the Greeks called them Mars and the Romans Moros. So, generally speaking, we call them Moors. It's like Morocco, like Mauritania. Okay, so the Anglicization of the term Moors. Okay, they made that distinction to be distinguished from the Africans of the day. That is, the Greeks and the Romans. So present-day Africans make the distinction between sub-Saharan Africa and northern Africa. And during the rule of the Moors from 711 the Common Era to 1492, essentially, millions of Europeans were enslaved. And it's usually it was the African model of slavery, not permanent, you're a war captive. So slave ports, so this is basically a British historian writing about, okay, this is the story of the Moors in Spain. This is what happened to them. This is how they were first there, got kicked out by the Romans, and then they came back. And part of what they did when they came back is, anybody ride horses? No? All right. So check with your equestrian friends, cowboys or not. how this relates to contemporary American is like this. Probably before today, you've never heard that Africans enslaved millions of Europeans. And this is a British textbook telling you that is in fact the case. Okay, a British scholar who reads Arabic and basically reading an original text. So when he's talking about slave ports like Sail, Tangier, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, Fez, and Marrakesh, and some northern Egyptian towns like Alexandria, etc., okay, those are all on the coast. Those are all slave ports. They're bringing millions of Europeans that they've militarily conquered to be sold. Now, they're using war horses and what they call those war horses today as a horse breed is Arabians. Now, back in those days, these horses were bred, well, they're war horses. These folks had cannons, they had guns. Because remember, Africans had a trading relationship with the Chinese before Europeans did, before Marco Polo. So they did have gunpowder. They had iron before Europeans. They had guns 75 years before Europeans. Only problem was that only selected tribes in Africa had guns because only selected tribes had trade with Chinese, never enough to affect the balance of power when Europeans came in with guns and gunpowder. But those Arabians, those war horses, were bred for battle. So guns going off, people screaming, explosions, etc., etc. They are hand-fed. They understand a vocabulary of about 100 words, hand-fed and raised like the family. There's actually a depiction of this within, what is that movie? Ben-Hur. It's an old movie from the 50s, maybe. Probably only Ken and I remember it, but there's a scene in there where these horses come into the tent. You know, come here, my lovelies, and he's hand feeding them. Well, that is an accurate depiction of how these horses were, how they were raised and trained. Now, the basic point is this. Full-blooded Arabians are what they call spirited. That means if they can sense your fear, and if you do not approach them with respect, they will throw you. So, what they do is a quarter horse is 1/4 full-blood Arab. So what they do is they breed the horse with other horse breeds to kind of dumb it down. You still want stamina, but you want less intelligence. Spirit comes from intelligence. Who is this fool trying to ride me? No. Okay? So you gentle it down and you create quarter horses. My basic point is this. You cannot teach someone what a quarter horse is until you teach them fractions. Make sense? You need to know what a quarter is before you can breed a quarter horse. And these Africans require literate and numerate slaves. It's basically like the Greek and Roman model. Or the Greeks and Romans got their model of slavery too. They needed, I was watching another old-time movie from the 50s, Kirk Douglas, Spartacus. And Tony Curtis is in the household of this Roman general, and he sings, and their singing is poetry. So he sings and he's a tutor. So they need, and you have to be literate to do that. All right? So Greeks and Romans required literate slaves, and the slave could be a war captive from any race. So in this, actually our word slave comes from the word Slavs, which is the Romans capturing people from that part of the world. Slav becomes slaves. the generic term. Okay, so they required literate slaves. So when they're being enslaved, they're being forced to work to, among other things, raise these horses, but they're also being educated if they weren't educated before, as a part of the condition of their slavery. And the model of slavery then is also not permanent. They can earn their freedom, but maybe not necessarily back to where they came, because now after 25 years, why would you go back? So you would settle. And if you settled there in North Africa, who are you going to mix with? Other slaves or free black Africans or both? And what would that do if you're European mixing with a black African? What will your children look like? Mixed. Or what we would call Arabs. Now, where this historically comes from, or we'll look at this when we look at the strange history of race in America, y'all had to check a box, or you voluntarily check a box when you either apply for a job, or if we track your ethnicity here. You may or may not notice that Arabs are considered Caucasian. Even though if you look at an Arab, if they're darker than the paper bag test, they're not considered white. But according to the census, they're Caucasian. Where did that come from? I'm suggesting here, but don't take my word for it. Investigate. So, for example, Sultan Moulay Ismail of Meknes, Morocco, had 25,000 European slaves who built his stables. Sudanese were also taken into slavery before the 15th century, but not as many as whites. So slavery is slavery. So that basic African model was that slavery was not a permanent condition. You could earn your freedom. And if you were captured by illiterate people, you had the right to education the same as any tribal member. So you could argue that the Moors are simply duplicating the practices of the Romans. So one answer is, one of the childhood questions after my first racial attack was, why do whites hate us so much? The ancestral memory of being enslaved by Africans could be one, but the traditional canon does not teach of this period. So where are they getting the memory? Why do they hate us so much? They don't all hate us, but if slavery, we know, provides such a psychological wound to black people, and that's only for 300 or 400 years, what would 700 years of slavery do to Europeans who basically wiped it out of their history as part of that trauma? Now, not everyone came from that era or area. So the traditional canon does not teach of this period, even though it was a British scholar that just gave you the information that I gave you. And he wrote 2 books, The Story of the Moors in Spain and The Story of the Moors After Spain. I think it's in your book list. So classical Greek and Roman authors refer to Berbers as black. Berbers / Moors, and basically the Saharan Sahel Fulani, the Tuareg. So all these people are referred to basically as black people, also by those names, Berbers and Moors. But they also make the distinction of these different tribal groups, Saharan Sahel Fulani, 2 different deserts, the Tuareg, the Zenaga, the Kunta, as in, if you remember Roots from the 60s, Kunta Kinte, Tebu, Traza in Mauritania and Senegal, Mogarba, Sudanese, Chamba of Chad and Algeria. So light-skinned people above the Sahara came from intermarriage. So the image of Arabs then as lighter-skinned, while they're classified in the American system as Caucasoids, still persist today. This is one